And with that, I'm going to introduce Rick Kogan, a longtime festival friend and a Chicago Tribune reporter. Thanks so much.
I'm not going to bore you with a lot of more thank yous. The thank you I want to give is to you people for loving books, for coming out and seeing and celebrating books. Give yourself a hand, please. I also want to thank my pal Elizabeth Taylor, who's editor-at-large, who is the curator of these things. An amazing thing about the winner of the Heartland Award today, it goes to my heart in many ways. In 2017, he was asked by the New York Times to name what he thought were his 4 greatest books that he'd ever read. He named Mike Royko's Boss as one of them. And he said, yeah, no kidding. And I have a little more about that too. And he said, he loved it because it reads like a crazed postmodern novel and brought back all kinds of happy memories of his Chicago childhood. He wrote a piece years before that about his Chicago childhood. Do many of you know where he's from? He's from Oak Forest. And he would go to a restaurant that was kind of on top of a hill, and he and his buddies would sit in there and they'd look out in the distance and see Chicago. And this is what our Heartland Prize winner wrote about that. My intellectual heroes were there, meaning in the city, Studs Terkel, the columnist Mike Royko, his creation, Slats Grobnik, who I assumed was a real guy. My Uncle John and his brothers were there, arguing politics like radicals out of Dostoevsky, only eating White Castles. The old town folk music scene was there, Steve Goodman, John Prine. Someday, when I could drive, I'd head downtown. Prine and Goodman would approach, go, you play guitar? A little, I'd say. Come with us, they'd say. We need some fresh ideas, and you seem pretty cool. We moved out too early. In truth, I didn't know the city well at all. But someday I would. I'd move there, live on Lakeshore Drive. That would be my base of operations. Yes, someday that burning white fire would know me too. I'd move around it with confidence, taking cabs, tipping bartenders who knew me by name, hanging out with Royko, who'd see me as his protege, the real thing, a true Chicago kid. Why live there? People would ask me. Why not Paris? Why not New York? Why, it is my city, I would reply. It contains everything one could ever desire. But then it was time to eat. The entire city, remember, he's standing in the south suburbs with his hand, the entire city could be blocked out with a thumb. But because you were a kid and Chicago was all you knew, it was in your heart and stayed there forever, the yardstick against which the rest of our universe was judged. Interviewing our Heartland Award winner will be my great friend and the Tribune book editor, Jennifer Day. And though I would very much like to steal this myself, it is my honor to present this year's Heartland Award to that Chicago kid who I must tell you Royko would have really loved. George Saunders.
Thank you. That was beautiful. Thank you. Thank you so much. I have to admit, I'm a little starstruck that Rick Kogan just introduced me. I feel so happy. and also that he said that Royko would be my friend. I'm pretty much just done, so thanks for coming. I find this award incredibly meaningful, partly because Rick and Jennifer and Chris Borelli were such dear friends to my daughter, Elena, who worked for the Tribune a few years ago. And, I teach at Syracuse, and I remember hearing Elena talking about these people and thinking teaching and mentoring is the most precious job in the world. So if for no other reason, this means so much to me, so thank you to the three of those people and to the Trib. Also, of course, it's meaningful because I'm from the Midwest, more particularly Chicago, the most Midwestern place, and most particularly the South Side, the part of Chicago that is most like Chicago. The very most Chicago part of Chicago. And I find myself thinking about the great Mike Royko. One of my earliest literary memories of sitting in our kitchen in Oak Forest, reading him in the Trib. And it was exciting because you knew he was just a few miles away. He was an actual guy whose voice sounded like yours, actually, and your neighbors' voices. And had written this piece that you were reading recently, maybe even yesterday. And when he wrote an especially good one, everyone, I remember, would be talking about it the next day. Did you read Royko? Even the nuns, you'd hear them talking among themselves. Did you read Royko? A long time ago, I heard Junot Diaz saying that one of the ways a young writer gets made is when he or she first realizes that language is power. And I think for me, Royko had that effect. Just seeing all these people I loved and respected huddling around the words of this man they'd never met. So as we all know, some people who have never been to the Midwest, they think it's like a Rockwell painting of America, calm, stoic people speaking softly about the crops, whatever. But my Midwest was different, and it was better. It was loud, it was manic, full of arguing and teasing, especially teasing, satire, SNL-style imitations of local authority figures, your teachers, your parents, and genuinely strange worldviews. Like, for example, my great-uncle was a maintenance man at the Drake. He was also a disciple of Madame Blavatsky, and he once mentally transported himself to work in the middle of the night while still being in his bed in Gage Park. So full of all kinds of dark undercurrents, but also ways of working with these undercurrents. So get-rich-quick schemes like Amway and Avon, and drinking, and that very special flavor of Southside Catholicism in which it wasn't uncommon for people at church to be hungover yet still dressed up. So it was a place rich in dissent and politics, and especially working people who understood at the core of their being that there were forces arrayed against them that were sapping their lifeblood for profit, and that one of the ways of fighting those forces was education, reading and political self-education, and yes, very much literature. In those days, late 60s, early 70s, were like now, crazy, scary times, but one thing that got us through, we believed collectively in Enlightenment values, civility, reason, truth, and especially our ability to get at truth and thereby defy power using language. This idea that literature is not an indulgence or a quaint remnant of some former time, but the most powerful chance a human being has at self-transformation. So this kind of award and these kinds of gatherings are important because they remind us all, and they say to the larger culture, that we still believe this. We still believe that language is not a sideshow. It's the essential way that we understand each other and make things better. So I'm very honored to be included in that stellar list. Thank you. So I'm very honored to be included in the stellar list of incredible writers who have won in the past, and very grateful to the Tribune and especially to all of you for being here today. Thanks. Hey.
So thank you,
hey,
and
thank
congratulations. Starting where you just left off, let's talk a little bit about growing up in Oak Forest and how that influenced your writing career.
Sure. Well, I mean, the main thing, as I was alluding to, is just that we were talkers. There was always banter. And I have this cousin, or this Uncle John that I refer to, they had a basement in Mount Greenwood, and we'd have these big Sunday parties. So the adults would be sitting around talking about Mayor Daley, or the hippies or whatever we're talking about. And as a kid, if you could get up, you could come up to the table, and you mostly were supposed to shut up. But if you said something and it wasn't stupid, or was funny, then you were kind of allowed to stay. So that was one way, just to, this Junot Diaz idea that language is power. I could see that if I could open my mouth and say something intelligent, suddenly I was regarded as an equal, so that was big. So just the whole idea, which I associate with the South Side, that you could be rough in speech, you could be naughty, you could be disrespectful, but what you couldn't be was boring. And and also, the undercurrent was you weren't really supposed to be dishonest either. If somebody would say something really lacerating to you, the first move in your mind was, is that true? And if it was, the code of honor was go, all right, and hopefully say something worse back. That would really, But so it was that, and then, also there was a kind of a warmth that I think, it's a weird relationship, but it feels to me like true human warmth sometimes comes in those kind of rough, environments. And I felt from the beginning of my life in Gage Park, and then later in Market Park, and then in Oak Forest, that there was just so much love around. So that was kind of the main thing. And then for me, the sort of classic transformative experience was I wasn't going to go to college because I didn't really know too many people that had. And my big career plan was I had a friend who knew a guy who knew a guy who knew a guy who was in the Eagles. So we were going to, just go on tour with the Eagles probably or something like that. And so I had these two high school teachers, Joe and Sherry Lindblom, out at Oak Forest. And I don't know, I'm not just saying this to be, I never studied. It just wasn't a thing I did. But they saw something in me, and somehow they started getting me to read. They gave me books to read. And in the middle of reading one of these books, I had this really weird thought, like, I could go to college. And it took the form of a college sweater, whatever the hell that is, It was me in a college sweater, talking to my friends about philosophy, And so by that time, I think it was senior year, and I hadn't applied anywhere yet. So Joe actually called the Colorado School of Mines and talked me in. He actually said, there's a kid who's, I think he hasn't been trying very hard, but he's a smart kid. You should think about letting him in. So this kind of, I think of it as a Chicago thing to do, because I wasn't their family. They didn't have to do it, but they saw something in me. They saw that I could have this life that I was on a course for, which would have been pretty small, I think, and crappy, because I think the Eagles thing wouldn't have probably panned out. And and then they took it upon themselves to get me out in the world, So that, to me, I always associate Chicago with that kind of warmth that is willing to actually believe that we are better when we're in a community than when we're just alone.
So you worked as a delivery driver for your dad's chicken restaurant, right?
I did, yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about how that sort of experience might have influenced your compassion for other people and just the characters that you came to create?
Sure. You've done your research, and this is frightening. We'll see what else my dad had two restaurants on the side, and the name, I'm sure you'll remember, Chicken Unlimited. Anybody remember that? Yeah, maybe not. But they had this really Zen or mantra or motto that was Chicken Unlimited doesn't stop at chicken. Think about it. I don't know. Yeah, so my dad worked for a company called Peterson Coal, and then at some point he had a falling out, and he had bought these two franchise restaurants. So I got the job of the delivery truck driver. So we had these two tricked out 77 Chevy vans with carpeted, even the ceiling. Like, I don't know what the thought was there. I think they were delivery vans. I don't know. Maybe they're, yeah. But so I would go around Midlothian, mostly Midlothian, Oak Forest, and sometimes out in Hazel Crest. And it's the best job for a young writer or would-be writer, because you just show up and somebody says, come into our house, stranger, and you have that precious maybe, minute of standing in the front door where they would go get the money, and you look around and whoa, there's a naked old man in there, or I used to have one guy who would come and he'd say, you're a good-looking young guy. Thank you. Yeah, you married? I said, no, I'm 16. He said, and he'd say, good, don't do it. It'll fuck up your life. Like, And here's a little tip for you, So I think it was kind of like, and I was a very judgmental kid, but somehow you couldn't not feel the joy of that kind of experience where you just say, I wonder who's in this house, and you get to go in, and the world, especially when you're 16, the world doesn't actually notice that you're there. So it just does its thing, and so it was kind of a series, every night a series of 10 or 15 little improv performances. This is the world. Oh, all right,
So by the time you got to the MFA program at Syracuse, you had lots of experience in the real world, but not necessarily a classically trained English degree, which is something that Tobias Wolff, your mentor, was quoted as saying that was something you had to get over. So can you talk a little bit about that? And I mean, were you intimidated by others who had that? Or?
Amazing, yeah, of course. I had, I was kind of a medium reader, but I had an engineering degree, so that took all my energy for those 4 years. And so I showed up at Syracuse and immediately could just tell that these people had traveled more than I had, they had read more, and they were more confident. And I actually had a moment that was, this will be a buzzkill, but I'll tell it anyway. We were all the grad students were out after drinking at this restaurant. And I just come from Amarillo, Texas, where my mom's from. And I'd been living kind of a pretty, low life. I working as a groundsman and had a lot of problems going on in the family and all kinds of, pretty dark stuff. But I thought, it's just like Kerouac. I'm like this emissary from the real world, from the heart of the country, and they're going to love it. They're going to love it. And I remember kind of just trying to open up and talk about some of these things. And there was this kind of, oh yeah, we know Amarillo. That's the place where they have all the currency exchanges. Ha ha ha. Kind of this scoffing about this, as if this place, because of its location, couldn't possibly have any valid literary value. And that was so different from what I expected. I really expected to get some cred because I was coming from an unusual place. And I just remember the moment when about halfway through, I'm like, okay, I'm not going to argue this anymore. And it was kind of humiliating a little bit. You knocked on the door and it wouldn't open. So I think that got deep in me. And because I was kind of in some ways, a bit confused and underread, I didn't quite realize that class was actually a thing that you could not only discover in yourself, but that you could write out of that power. And it took me, after that, maybe another 10 years to finally go, oh yeah, every minute of your life you've been worrying about money. And every minute of your life you felt the kind of low ceiling of paucity, And we weren't poor, but it's just the idea that working people, mostly what they're thinking about is work. And I'd never really considered that might be a topic for literature. So it was all trout fishing in Spain, which for me, a little bit of a stretch, you could.
So at what point did you come to that realization? What triggered it?
It was actually years after Syracuse. My wife and I, we got engaged in 3 weeks in the romantic Syracuse ambiance, and we had 2 daughters, and both of the pregnancies were problematic because Paula had to go to bed at 4 months, both times, and stay in bed for the last 5 months. So in a very quick time, we'd gone from these kind of groovy, new style beatniks to like Ozzie and Harriet if they were broke and grouchy, like whoa. So it was kind of that, and then I was working at a tech writing place as a tech writer, or actually it was an engineering company, and I had written this book. I had gone to Mexico to a friend's wedding, a friend from here. And I came back from that wedding, and it had like a radical Catholic priest in it. There was a male model / surfer in the wedding party. It's in Mexico. So I come home and I actually said to Paula, you are sitting on a gold mine. Just let me write this book. So I was working full time. I drink a pot of coffee and sometimes a bottle of Boone's Farm, which I really don't recommend. Even if you're not a writer, don't drink that shit. But then I would just stay up and I would write this book, this Mexican novel. And it was so you can judge its literary value, it was called La Boda de Eduardo. Like Ed's wedding. So I wrote this book, 700-page book.
Oh, wow.
Voila.
Wow.
Send me my money. And I gave it to Paula, and I'll never forget this. I went out of the room kind of like, yeah, just take your time. And then I immediately looked back in, and she's on about page 6, and she's sitting like this. Because she knew what it had cost us as a family, and it was just not and as soon as she did that, I went, yeah, I knew that. I kind of knew it. It's heartbreaking, So anyway, the next day I went into work in that holiest of artistic states, which is totally emptied out of any sense that I was any good. Like, yeah, I don't know anything about this. Maybe it's all been a big mistake. Okay, world, I'm open. And in that state of mind, I was doing transcribing a conference call, and it was so boring. And I just kept making up these little scatological poems, kind of naughty little poems, da-da-da-da, and Dr. Seuss, da-da-da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da. And when I'd finish one, I'd flip it over and make a little cartoon, like a real crude sketch of it. And I made about 15 of those just out of boredom, and brought them home that night and threw them on the table and went to play with the kids. And all of a sudden, heard this holy sound, which was Paula laughing with genuine pleasure, And no one had reacted with pleasure to my writing for so long, If there are young writers here, they're probably, that thing where someone says, I read your story. I did. I really, that kind of. So this was the first time where there was spontaneous thing. So in that in that moment, I realized something not about class yet, but what I realized was about entertainment, and that for me on the South Side, the only thing I really knew about art was that it was joyful. You'd listen to George Carlin or Steve Martin, or Jaws was a huge movie for me. There was always that visceral excitement that I understood. The intellectual stuff where someone would say, oh, it's a novel about patriarchy using 15th century falconing as a motif. I'm like, so that was the first thing, was that, oh yeah, it's supposed to be fun and it's supposed to light you up first. Then when I started writing that way, they were always about class. They were always about, or money, or work, or that, as Terry Eagleton says, capitalism plunders the sensuality of the body. That moment where you go, oh, I'm not living as well as I could because I have all these material concerns, But it came out of the fun. That was the first kind of motive,
Well, and let's back up a little bit. So you mentioned becoming a father also put pressure on you, and you took this job. So let's talk about being a father and how that's influenced your work, particularly since Lincoln in the Bardo is very much about a father's journey.
Right. Well, the biggest thing was, and I know you have a 2-year-old, so the biggest thing for me was that before we had our kids, I was always a pretty decent person. I kind of self-regulated. I wasn't particularly bad, and even when I was bad, I felt terrible about it, and I would kind of. So that's being good, right? That's pretty much. But before we had our kids, I think I was having trouble writing anything meaningful because I kind of thought, well, what's the difference if somebody does something good or bad? I didn't really feel it as that it made that much difference, actually. Then as soon as we had our kids, the light went on. I'm like, oh, if I can love this little person that much, that means everybody theoretically, hopefully, has been loved that much or can love that much, and suddenly the whole world filled with moral import. Before, when you're a young writer, you're trying to write something meaningful. Well, it has to be about the Holocaust, or the big space aliens who eradicate human beings. Suddenly my gaze got to where even a small exchange in an elevator was actually fraught with morality because there were 2 full human beings there, So the biggest thing was just that. It made me, as I'm sure everyone, who has kids knows this feeling, that the world comes into focus and you go, oh, that's actually why I'm here. It's not actually to write books, It's to have a little beloved being and then try to do something nice for her so her life is slightly better than yours. Then going back to the books, there was something to write about. And I thought, if you can take a paragraph and use that paragraph to make a reasonable facsimile of a human being, then suddenly you've got everything. You've got plot, you've got all that, because we all should care what happens to another human being if they're made in front of us. So that was the big thing. And then, of course, there was also an element of, in sort of like, it sped up my desire to try to get a middle-class life, basically, because when we were first married, we had no money, and we were just 2 artists who were in love, and we thought, the money will come, no worries. And then suddenly you have a toddler, and you're saying, wow, kindergarten starts pretty soon. I just remember thinking, please God, let me put together a semblance of a life that she doesn't notice as being poorer than it should be, just for her sake. And then it became this real race. And part of it, for me, artistically, was really helpful. If you give me, 6 months in a luxurious room in the south of France, I won't do anything. I'll research something. I'll get nervous and I don't know. But when someone says, as they did say to us, your school bill is due in 2 weeks, then again, the South Side, I kind of know how to do that. And what it does is it takes the bullshit parts of me, the pseudo-intellectual parts of me, the parts that weren't well trained in college to be an English major, it puts those aside and it puts forward the part that loved Jaws and that likes to do shtick in front of people and kind of the entertainment thing. So I tell my students at Syracuse, part of this sort of trajectory of becoming an artist is to sort of say, all right, I cannot fake it for 300 pages. I can't manufacture an alternate person to write my book. I have to take all of those selves that I am, even the ones I'm embarrassed or ashamed of, and they have to learn to play together. You can't manufacture. When I was a kid here, I noticed I wasn't dating much. I just noticed that, and and I thought, and I at the same time, this is terrible. I heard a tape of myself talking, like, wow, you talk so fast. You sound weird. I wouldn't date you either. So I made a resolution to slow my speech down somewhat, and thus become more charming. And of course that was worse. Can a 14-year-old have a stroke? What's going on? So I mean, the message is that you basically have to use what you've got, and the beauty for me of both being an artist and teaching artists is that you see that whatever a young person has, it's 100% sufficient if they treat it with craft. And what that means is draw it out, accept it, then say, okay, I have this defect. And the gods of art say, hey, it's not a defect. You saying it's a defect imprints it. But if you don't say it's a defect, if you say it's an energy, then you can accommodate it. And it's no different than personality. Each of us has learned in our life to be charming, to take whatever weirdness we're born with and kind of transform it into a possible positive, exactly the same process in art. So that's a blessing to have a life like that where you get to do that every day.
So I'm curious then, one of the reviews of Lincoln in the Bardo, it chalked up, let me just read a quick quote. It says, perhaps your subject, late capitalism, which has immiserated so many, is exposed less by angry clarity than by a certain poetics of kindness.
That's beautiful. Did you write that?
No, Charlie Finch wrote it in the Tribune. But the reason I want to bring that up now, I mean, so you seem to be such a kind person, and you're talking about personality influencing work. Is that just natural that you would approach these subjects with kindness then, or is that something that you had to work towards?
I had to work for it because I'm also not kind. I'm actually a smart ass, And no, I mean, I'm one of those middle-aged white guys who, if you get me mad, I suddenly get really irrationally mad, I don't have, and I haven't done that in a number of years, but you can always feel that little monster in you, that. So I think and this is maybe the other side of the South Side, there's a lot of lacerating humor that sometimes goes too far. I've heard people really get their feelings hurt by a joke. So I have that part of myself too. I have, but this is what I mean is in order to get to the kindness, I think you have to sometimes let the other animal out of the cage as well. So my early stories are not on the surface kind at all. I mean, they're savage, I think they are actually compassionate in the sense that they let the darkness out and then they try to accommodate it. But for me, the whole story of my artistic thing has been when I was younger as a writer, I wasn't good enough to be kind on the page. I wasn't confident enough. It takes a lot of confidence to be compassionate towards characters. It was much easier to sort of lacerate capitalism, which needs to be done, actually. But now, as I'm getting older and I've had all this good luck in my life, I'm like, it's actually harder to represent positive phenomena on the page. That's why our great writers are the ones who do it. Shakespeare does it. Gogol does it. Toni Morrison does it. So I think, there's somebody said happiness writes white, meaning a good day with people you love is not a story. Something has to go awry. So it takes more technical chops to get there. So I'm glad that that's showing up in my work, and I hope it will continue to show up in me personally too. Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about Lincoln in the Bardo specifically, since this award is for that book. Can you talk a little bit about, specifically one scene sort of haunts me. It's the one where all of the ghosts, so maybe we should set up the book very briefly.
Just have them read it. Have them buy, if you buy 5 copies.
Have you all read it?
You buy 5 copies, read them sequentially, and then we'll meet again.
So, would you like to set up the book very briefly?
Yeah. So basically the story, it's one night in a graveyard in D.C., and historically we know that newspapers at the time said that Lincoln was so heartbroken by the death of his son Willie that he went into the crypt on several occasions. And some of the accounts say he actually interacted with the body somehow. So it's basically that night, and I just said, let's look at that and see how it might have happened if it did happen. So one of the things I found out early was, if it's just a guy in a graveyard, it's either you're writing a first-person book from the point of view of Lincoln, which is, I don't recommend it, the 407 years ago, or you populate it. And the only other way to populate it that I could think of was a grave digger, which, I don't know what he's doing there at 2 a.m. He's like rehearsing, or, oh, that's a rectangle, yeah. So then in the book, these ghosts got in there. And so the book is kind of just Lincoln coming into the place and having actually 2 interactions with his son's body, and then kind of repenting of it and leaving. But the whole thing is observed by these ghosts who are in this realm called the Bardo, which is kind of loosely based on the Tibetan idea. And they're there because they died unhappy. They weren't able to kind of get free of whatever it was that was either attaching them to this life or tormenting them in it. So by force of will, they're kind of lingering there, kind of like ghosts.
Right.
Yeah.
So
it's a real laugh riot.
The scene I wanted to talk about briefly, it was all of the ghosts are sort of deformed by the things that are keeping them attached. And so at some point, they all need to pile into Lincoln, the man himself. They need to physically move into him to try to change his mind to do something. And it's at that moment when all the ghosts are in there together that they actually see each other in their best forms.
Right.
And this is maybe going a little bit too heady, but it made me think of Hannah Arendt and her idea that, you're not a fully realized person until you've presented yourself in the public space. And I'm just wondering, particularly given your writing on Trump and everything else, can you talk a little bit about how you think people are when they work together with some common good in mind? That's
a great question. Yeah, one of the things you hope for when you write a book or a story is that it surprises you. And this book really did. And what surprised me, and I actually didn't even notice that this was in the book until really late in the game. There's a pattern in the book that I've come to think of as viral goodness, where all these beings, they're miserable, they're unhappy, they're totally self-centered because it takes all their energy to stay in this Bardo state. So they're like people who've been in a train station for 40 years and they hate each other, Then Willie shows up and suddenly, and again, I didn't plan this, there's just this pattern where each person would kind of open up, do one good thing that would help another person open up, and by the end of the book, a number of these people have been transformed enough to go on to the next thing. It was really interesting to me to see that happen spontaneously in the book. I didn't plan it, it just happened. And the weird thing is, having made it happen in prose, I started noticing it in real life. That actually there is a viral goodness, also viral badness, as we know. So I found that kind of beautiful because it means that actually you could make the case that everything you do in a day, everything, the smallest gesture, the smallest look, is potentially contributory to this viral phenomenon. In a time like this, you kind of feel like, things are so messed up, nothing matters. That's the worst. That despair is, I think, maybe the greatest sin. So this way of thinking made me think, well, let's pretend that if every person in this room went forth with that idea, that every second actually matters, every kind gesture, every slightly helpful thing, that we might actually make a pattern from the 1,000 people in here. That pattern, I think scientifically, you could observe it. You could actually observe a small ripple effect of, and in this moment, I think what that would look like was a little bit of relaxation, a little bit less panic, a little more confidence in our own firsthand experiences as opposed to our virtual experiences and our cable TV experiences. I feel and I know you do too, that you're capable of being very loving in your real life and making a place of comfort for yourself in that way. But then you turn on TV or you get on the internet and it seems like there's a different world there. It is. It's a virtual world. It's an invented world in which people behave like crap, you know? So to me, that there's some comfort in that. I think we're actually pretty well-mannered still. I drove across the country 5 times in the last 2 years. You know, you go to a ballpark or you go to a concert, or you go on the subway, people are generally pretty good to each other. So there's something about this idea of viral goodness that I'm using as to comfort myself a little bit so I don't totally panic. And,
Yeah.
you know. I kind of when I wrote a piece for the New Yorker about the Trump rallies, and I got some mail, as you might imagine, and so I tell the story, I don't quite know what to make of it, I'll tell it to you. This woman wrote me, "You stupid, elite, ignorant, liberal, leftist, elitist, blah, 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 on and on and on." I said, "Hi, this is George. You know, I just got your email. I'm sitting here in my pajamas, and I noticed that you insulted me more in the first paragraph than I insulted anybody in a 14,000-word piece." She wrote back, we started, you know, and we're kind of getting along, you know. And then she says, I just want you to know, one thing I have to say to you, since you're a liberal, is that you do know that 50% of all American Muslims are in favor of Sharia law. I said, "Madam, that's bullshit." She said, "I'll send you the link." So she sends me an article, and the article, you know, it says right there in the headline, 50% of American. The text seemed to be from a different story. And it had a really like a lovely story about an imam in Dallas who said he thought most American Muslims, like most American Christians, at the 11th hour would probably put their spiritual life over their country. And he said, I'm not sure that's a good thing or a bad thing. So this is the article. And then in the sidebar, it's got things like Obama to cut off food on election day. And the author of this piece was Kurt. You know that journalist Kurt?
Kurt? Yeah. We all know.
So I put on my English teacher hat and I spent like a long time deconstructing the thing, pointed out, sent it to her, and I expected her to blow it off. She said, "That is so helpful. I'll have to read more carefully in the future." So that was good, right?
Yeah.
That was good. Yeah. But then I told this story in the same self-flattering spirit I just told it. To a friend, and I don't know the name of the comedian, but there's a comedian who says, you know, in times like these, if I can just change one heart, we're fucked. Because there's so many, you know, so.
Yeah. So, let's talk about talking to people in this political moment. I mean, you wrote a lovely essay for The Guardian about the key to ambient intelligence in a piece of writing is specificity, and you also relate that to how we communicate, particularly in social media. Can you talk a little bit about what you mean by that and how we might all relate to one another a little bit better? Sure.
Well, here's what, if you teach, I've taught creative writing workshops for 20 years, and here's what you find. The first level of critique, the laser critique, is always, "Dear Jim, your story is boring. I think what you should do is make it less boring." You know? Other than that, it was kind of slow, you know, like that. Well, so what you find as a teacher is nobody can do anything with that except resent it. You know, of course, how could you not? There's nothing. Now, if you force the student who's writing a critique to be specific, where is it boring? What, you know, then the next incarnation becomes, your story is a little slow on page 10. Where? Well, right here. Where? Okay, at the line, "The cat leapt onto the black table, the ebony surface, the dark planed," you know. All right, that is, well, boring. Yeah, but if we eliminate the judging word, we see actually it's not boring as much as it's repetitive. And if we look at that a little longer, it's repetitive, but actually what's communicated by the repetition is a lack of respect for the reader and a slight tendency to show off, you know. So you can just say, "Dear Jim, I suggest you cut the second 2 references to the cat on page 10. Love, Elliot," you know. Then Jim, if you know, he cuts them and he's got a better story. So the snark and anger and all that kind of stuff, I think it generally comes out of faulty projection. and all projection is faulty, actually. And the great gift of literature, especially revising literature, is that for some reason specificity lands better. Specificity works better. It takes us out of the realm of the potentially hurtful judging thing into the realm of the specific. So if I say, Frank was an asshole, that's judgy, it's a little vague, it's not the greatest sentence. Then the gods of fiction say, okay, that's just your first draft. Frank was an asshole. How so? Because that's how they talk, and then you say, okay, Frank was an asshole because he insulted the young barista. Why do you think he did that? Okay, Frank insulted the young barista because she reminded him of his dead wife, Maria. Well, suddenly you've gone from Frank the asshole, and reader and writer are looking down on Frank, that idiot. Now suddenly Frank is a guy who's so capable of loving Maria that when she passed, he couldn't even muster up the basic decency to be nice to a young person. I'm a lot more interested in that guy than in the first one. I'm actually more compassionate. We talk about compassion in literature. That's actually what that means, is I see you, Frank. You are an asshole still. But you're a specific asshole, and I think we could work with this if we get you a date or whatever it is,
Yeah.
So I think for me, specificity in writing and teaching, and I think probably in politics, if you say you're a heartless Republican asshole, it feels good if you're a Democrat. If you're a Republican, it feels good to say you're part of a mob, you mindless liberal, whatever. I'm not as good at that one because I don't. But if you say those things, and it is fun, but if you say it and you say, no, let's remember the specificity, why do I think that? And then you can dig your way down through the layers of vitriol to the actual thing itself. And if you keep going, I think what happens is you end up with policy. It's not emotional, it's policy. Do you really mean to separate those kids from their parents? Yes, all right. But if you keep going, eventually I think you get to, at least to a place where we can say we disagree about a fact. That's workable, and then we don't have to hate anybody. Yeah. I mean, you still can hate somebody, but you don't have to. That's it.
Well, you wrote a book that you had to clearly delve into Civil War research to write it, and I've had conversations with very smart people who think we may be looking at another Civil War. At least it feels very bitterly divided right now. Did you feel like the work you did at all informed your view of the current moment?
I thought you were going to say cause it. I'm like, no, I don't, I saw Margaret Atwood was in Syracuse a couple of days ago. What a wonderful performance. And she basically said, no, she doesn't think so. And she listed why. She said geography, the vastness of the country, and also our good habits of democracy. So I actually think geography is if everybody who was on the right lived west of the Mississippi, it would be you'd know where to fight, But I think, in my family, I have a lot of Trump supporters, and I love them dearly, and I'm not, the guy at the top is causing a lot of really bad things through, I think, basically being a very shallow, boring, selfish person who shouldn't be in that job. Now he is, and God bless him, but he didn't train for it, essentially, and he's dispositionally not what he's dispositionally not what we've come to expect. Let's put it that way. All right, but I'm in a place now where I feel like I'm not going to give up any more of the things I cherish to that guy. I'm not giving up my love for my family. I'm not giving up my basic cheeriness and my ability to love other people and maybe even transform them or be transformed. And I'm certainly not giving up literature, So that's my kind of new thing is why I'm amazed actually that we spend so much time obsessing over a person who, if he was in your workplace, you'd be trying to move your desk away. No, seriously, I'm not. If you had a boss or a fellow worker who was, and I'm actually saying this, if they're Trump supporters here, I'm saying this to you with love. If you had somebody who was that heedless of other people's feelings, that excited to prod people at their weakest places, that willing to accept power in exchange for touching old racist, misogynist tropes, you would not want to be around that person, and you would quickly tire of hearing their nonsense. Now, because he's in power, of course, we obsess over this, but the place I'm in right now is to say, I'm not writing about that anymore, and I'll talk in this setting about it, but I'm going to start saying, you're boring, you know? Mm-hmm. I heard Stiller and Miro one time in Syracuse, and he was on stage and she was sitting in the front row, and part of their shtick was he would start telling stories about the vaudeville days, and she'd go, Jerry, you're boring! so that's the sound I'm starting to hear in my head whenever I Donald, you're boring!
Well, on that note, then let's switch back to your work.
Okay, yeah, that's right.
The theme here at the Humanities Festival this year is graphic, and so I thought maybe you'd like to talk a little bit about the film adaptation of Lincoln and the Bardo, and also there was a VR version of it as well, a virtual reality short that was made of it.
Right. There's a wonderful director named Graham Sack who approached me about making a virtual reality, a little 10-minute burst, and it's amazing because you're sitting there looking at Willie, and you can see the stars, and you can see other ghosts around you, and suddenly Lincoln comes breezing by, and you're like, Abe, can I ask a question? But yeah, so and then now Nick Offerman and Meg Mullally opted the book, and we're co-producing it, and I think I'm about to start writing the script. That's the challenge. And yeah, well, maybe. So the challenge really is, you know, the book, for me, the thrill of the book was, it took me about 20 years to start the book. And the reason was that I couldn't imagine how you would write that material so it wouldn't be too sad or wouldn't be too sort of stiff with history, you know. So the weird formal shape of the book came out of the desire to just try to, follow that holy writing edict, don't suck. Like, don't write it the way that would be a drag, you know. So it sort of involved inventing this form and kind of breaking the fourth wall a little bit and all that. So now we're trying to come up with a way to do that so that the film isn't just a film of the book. We'd like the film to be as radical and moving and weird and maybe a little off as the book is. So we're working with a director who I can't name yet, but who is amazing about this and has got some really great ideas how to visually mimic the weirdness of the book. So yeah.
That's great.
Yeah. It's actually going to be an invisible movie. So you just make it up, and it still costs $25, but you can't see it.
So in our last few minutes here, I want to ask a few questions that were submitted by the audience in advance. Thank you for doing that. So let's see. Roberta Ritter asks, I'm curious as to how you developed the concept of using the voices of the dead, as well as the unusual aspects of the afterlife, souls becoming smaller, getting stuck, carrying their worst flaw into the Bardo, etc. This book is unique and wonderfully written, and it's not like any other book I've ever read.
Oh, thank you to you. Thank you, Roberta, over here. Thank you. There's that line in Hemingway, or I think Hemingway, where they say, how did you go broke? And he says, gradually and then all at once. So that book, I think about it, and there are so many, over that 20-year period of waiting, there were so many things that were happening kind of in parallel to make that book. And I think the biggest one was I had tried a novel way back when our kids were little, set in a graveyard in Rochester, New York, and the internet chat lines had just started. And I thought they looked so cool on the page. There'd be a heading, the person's name, and then some, kind of badly spelled and punctuated stuff. And then a response, and then sometimes the response would be delayed and cross responses. So I started writing that graveyard book in that form. And, when you're a writer, sometimes you just find certain cool places that you like. You can't really articulate why, they're just fun. And in that book, the fun thing was the pattern of response, the call and response, and the weird junctures between speeches. So I really liked that, but that book didn't really have a driver. It was just a bunch of talking with no plot, so I finally gave it up. And then years later, I finally decided to try to write this Lincoln book, and I've been trying to write it as a play, which because I'm from the South Side, I can't write a play, I can only write a play. You know, it's like, ooh, all this declaiming and stuff. So, but anyway, so then I got 2 notes that really made a difference. One was Deborah Treisman, who's been my editor at the New Yorker forever, and I was kind of bellyaching about this Lincoln stuff. And she said, why don't you write it as prose? And somehow, hearing this person I respected so much say it, I'm like, yeah, why don't I do that? Of course. And then I had a former student, also from Chicago, Adam Levin, who said to me, I think if you ever wrote a novel, you'd write it in the form of a series of monologues. And I thought, oh yeah, that would be fun, you know. And then as soon as I thought that, I remembered that old book and just kind of brought it forward, you know. So I think the writing thing, in my experience, it's much less rational and pre-planned than I thought it was when I was only a reader. I think the whole the magic element is intuition applied at the moment of rereading, basically. So the book kind of took shape over maybe 3 or 4 months. That form did, and then the golden moment was was writing one of those history scenes that was made up of all true historical tidbits, and I'm on the floor with about 40 index cards with these different things, and I'm arranging them. And then when I got it together, it really felt like a scene from a novel, even though I hadn't written a word of it.
I'm curious how you invented the fake nonfiction. Is that something that you just sort of filled in where you felt like you needed a hole that real life wasn't saying? Okay.
Yeah, there's a party scene in the beginning of the book, and I had all those tidbits like I just described, and it made a nice party scene. But I'd been imagining that party in my head for 20 years on and off, and the party that came out of those tidbits wasn't the party I had in my head. So at some point I just thought, oh, I could invent. I just saw this. I just saw these 2 people standing in the corner of that party. Can I do that? And I thought, this voice went, it's your book. Oh, all right. So then I thought, oh my God, that's so exciting. I can use the authority of the history bits to lure you in, and then I can spice it up with whatever I like, you know. Mm-hmm. And then the trick was I did that. I did one whole pass, and all the stuff I made up, of course, was really fancy. Mm-hmm. You know, it always sounded like Cormac McCarthy or or really manic. And so anybody who read that version would be able to go fake, 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 fake. So then I thought, okay, now if you really want to be a writer, you have to go through and dumb down all those fancy things and make them fit the matrix so nobody can identify them. And that was a big day where, finally I realized you could be a writer by being quieter instead of being louder.
We have a question here from an aspiring writer who asks, do you have any advice on how to help your brain along when you're going from spreadsheets and nonstop meetings to sitting alone in front of a computer, feeling like you could do anything and hoping you can do something? Thank you so much.
There's a name on that?
It says anonymous.
Anonymous, you got it. You're right. That's the $1 million question.
Yeah.
I guess the one thing I would say is I tell my students this. Part of being an artist is self-gaming. To take honest stock of how you work and honest stock of all the cross voices and the negative voices, and then say, okay, I'm going to try to manipulate my reality to increase the things that are positive and decrease the things that are negative. So one thing I would tell this person is, trust me, you can write a book in 15-minute increments at work, because I did it. My first book was written that way. You can. So what I'm saying is maybe you could destabilize your assumption that it takes 7 hours of writing and a lakeside cabin, which we all have that assumption because writing's hard, and we think the way to do something hard is in long blocks of extended concentration. Maybe that's ideal, but if you can say to yourself, you know what, you get to live once in this life. If you don't write a book, you're going to be unhappy. Give yourself permission to write it when you feel exactly the way you describe it, and you'll see your brain will go, okay. We doing that? Okay. When I was here, I'll tell this story. I tell this to my students. I was living in Oak Forest in my aunt's basement, and I was roofing, but I think I had just gotten fired, and I wasn't writing. And I thought, the reason I can't write is because I have never done anything cool. So I thought I'm going to go to El Salvador, and I'll be a war correspondent. Of course. I had no money, I didn't speak Spanish, I had no journalistic training. So I'm at the Acorn Library in Oak Forest, and I'm studying Spanish in the most pathetic way, like, ¿Dónde está la casa de Pepe? And so I take a break, and I'm going to go see this very dear friend of mine that I've known since first grade. And we were kind of Catholic buddies, like we're kind of, so I thought I can talk to him. I go to his house. He's not home. His dad is there. And his dad is a South Side Chicago, I think he was, I don't know what he did, but some kind of physical labor. And I'd never seen him out of this T-shirt, and I never spoke a word to him. But I thought, I'm a grown-up. And so we talked, and he said, so what are you doing? I said, well, and I kind of hesitated. I thought, he's going to kill me. I want to be a writer. He said, And I said, I'm going to go to El Salvador and be a war correspondent. And he said, is that your dream? I said, yeah, it is. He goes, well, you better fucking do it. I said, yeah. He said, you know why, right? I said, He said, if you don't do it, you know who you're going to blame. I said, yeah, myself. He goes, bullshit. You'll blame your wife and kids. Yeah. So the reason I tell this story is that, I meet so many talented young writers, and we all have neuroses. And so a lot of the people who want to be writers are often type A people who have really, really active, healthy consciences. And they're always giving reasons why they might not succeed, or why, if they did succeed, it might not be good for them, or whatever obstructions you make. So I just always tell that story to say, trust me, you're going to be a happier 45-year-old if you give it a shot. You don't have to succeed, because that's beyond our power. We don't know about that. But if you have sometime in your life, a 3 or even a 1-year period where you're truly indulging your dream, whatever it is, you're going to be a better parent and a better child. And sometimes you see people who maybe have a heavy guilt thing going on about producing. Sometimes that snaps them out of it. In other words, the idea that you're not going to be a better person in the world, a more helpful person, if you're bitter. And trying to do it is a good way to get rid of bitterness, So that's what I would say. She can do it. He or she can do it, for sure.
That's great.
Yeah.
Well, I'm afraid we need to wrap up.
Okay.
So thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you.
It was such a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you. That was cool.